Hey, what is up everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a figure who walks the galaxy like a ghost. He has no army, no homeworld, no chapter to call his own. He carries 2 pistols and a sword he has never once drawn in battle. His name is not really a name at all, but a title, and even that title conceals more than it reveals. For 10,000 years, he has moved through the darkness between stars, appearing on battlefields and in the halls of power, leaving chaos and confusion in his wake before vanishing like smoke on the wind. As entire chapters of Space Marines have dedicated themselves to hunting him, the most elite warriors of the Imperium, the Adeptus Custodes themselves, have tried to hold him prisoner. Imperial assassins from the deadliest temples in existence have been dispatched to end his life. None of them have succeeded for long. His confirmed kills include planetary governors, chaos lords, space marine chapter masters, sorcerous covens, cult leaders, and high-ranking members of the Inquisition. He has fought alongside chaos terminators and demon princes. He has stood shoulder to shoulder with Imperial guardsmen and loyal space marines. He once helped rescue a Primarch from imprisonment and walked him all the way to the doorstep of the Golden Throne on Holy Terror. And then, when the moment came to finally complete whatever mission had driven him across the centuries, the doors were closed in his face. He was arrested. He was thrown into the most secure prison in the entire Imperium, a facility from which no one had ever escaped. He broke out within hours. This is the story of Cypher, and after all these millennia, after all the bloodshed and the betrayal and the whispered rumors that follow him like a shadow, the most terrifying thing about him is this: nobody knows whose side he is actually on. He is the constant in a galaxy of variables, the fixed point around which chaos, in both the literal and figurative sense, seems to orbit. Armies have been diverted from strategic objectives to pursue him. Chapters have been destroyed because of him. The greatest fortress in the Imperium has been infiltrated because of him. And through it all, he walks with the calm assurance of a man who knows exactly where he is going, even if no one else can figure out the destination. There is something deeply unsettling about a character who cannot be categorized. In the grim darkness of the far future, loyalties are supposed to be absolute. You serve the Emperor, or you serve the Dark Gods. You are a hero, or you are a villain. The entire structure of the Imperium, its propaganda, its religious fervor, its brutal enforcement of conformity, all of it exists to eliminate ambiguity. There is no room for shades of grey in a universe that runs on binary certainties. And then there is Cypher, who is nothing but shades of grey, who defies every attempt to pin him down, who has been called a hero by those he has saved, and a monster by those he has betrayed, often in the same engagement, often in the same hour. He is the contradiction that the Dark Angels cannot resolve, the variable that will not be solved, the cipher, if you will forgive the pun, that has resisted decryption for 100 centuries. Welcome to Q on 40,000. Get comfortable, settle in. Because to truly understand the being known as Cypher, we need to go back a very long time. We need to go back to the very beginning, to a world of dark forests and monstrous beasts, where knightly orders rode out to do battle against creatures born from the corruption of the warp itself. We need to go back to Caliban. Picture a world unlike anything you have ever seen, not the gleaming spires of a hive city or the endless industrial sprawl of a forge world. Caliban was something older, something primal. It was a death world, classified as such by the cartographers of the Imperium. And for good reason. The entire surface was choked with dense, twisted forests that seemed to pulse with a malevolent intelligence. These were not ordinary trees. The very wood seemed to watch you as you passed. The shadows between the trunks moved in ways that had nothing to do with the wind. And within those forests prowled creatures that would give a hardened warrior nightmares for the rest of his life. They called them the Great Beasts. Enormous predators, warped and twisted by the touch of chaos. Though the people of Caliban did not have that word for it yet. They only knew that these monsters were death incarnate, that they stalked the paths between the scattered human settlements with a hunger that could never be satisfied. To travel between the fortress monasteries that dotted Caliban's surface was to gamble with your life. One wrong turn, one moment of inattention, and the forest would swallow you whole. But in response to this constant threat, the human population of Caliban had organized themselves into knightly orders. These were brotherhoods of warriors, trained from childhood in the arts of combat, dedicated to protecting their communities from the horrors that lurked beyond the walls. They wore what passed for power armor on that isolated world, carried crude but effective weapons, and rode out into the forests to hunt the great beasts with a courage that bordered on insanity. Among all these orders, one stood above the rest. They called themselves simply the Order, and they were led by two of the most remarkable warriors Caliban had ever produced. The first was a man named Luther, a charismatic leader beloved by his followers, whose skill with a blade was legendary. Luther was the kind of man who could walk into a room and immediately become its center of gravity. His voice carried conviction the way a river carries water, naturally and irresistibly. Warriors who fought alongside him would later say that his presence made them feel invincible, that when Luther raised his sword and called the charge, death itself seemed to hesitate before approaching. The second was a figure of far stranger origins. He had been found as a wild child in the deepest reaches of the forest, naked and alone, surviving among the very beasts that would have torn any ordinary man apart. They said he had killed a Calibanite lion with his bare hands before he was old enough to speak a human language. They said the forest itself seemed to obey him, parting before him as he walked, closing behind him as though protecting its most dangerous child. His name was Lion L. Johnson, and he was no ordinary man. He was a primarch, one of the 20 demigod sons of the Emperor of Mankind, scattered across the galaxy in infancy by the machinations of the Chaos Gods. Together, as Luther and the Lion united the knightly orders of Caliban, they waged a great campaign to cleanse the planet of the great beasts, pushing deeper and deeper into the forests until the last of the monsters had been slain. It was a golden age for Caliban, a time of unity and purpose that the world had never known before, and it was during this time that a very particular office within the Order took on an importance that would echo across the millennia. An office known as the Lord Cypher. Well, we will come to that title soon enough. But first, you need to understand what happened next. Because the Emperor of Mankind came to Caliban, he came with his armies, his technologies, and his vision of a united humanity spreading across the stars. He came to claim his lost son, and when Lionel Johnson saw his father for the first time, something shifted in the fabric of the galaxy. The lion knelt, he pledged his sword, and Caliban was forever changed. The knightly orders were disbanded. Their members, those young enough and strong enough, were subjected to the brutal surgical procedures that would transform them into space marines, the superhuman warriors of the First Legion, the Dark Angels. Those too old for the full transformation, Luther among them, were given lesser enhancements that extended their lives and increased their abilities. But they would never be true Astartes. They would always be something less, something in between. And that distinction would fester like a wound that never healed. The Lion took his legion to the stars. He left Luther behind on Caliban with orders to continue training new recruits and sending them to the front lines of the Great Crusade. It was meant as an honor, a recognition of Luther's importance to the legion. But Luther did not see it that way. He saw it as exile. He saw his old friend, the wild boy he had found in the forest and raised to greatness, casting him aside now that he had no more use for him. And in the silence of Caliban's great fortress, with the Lion thousands of light years away, conquering worlds in the Emperor's name, something dark began to grow in Luther's heart. It was the kind of darkness that feeds on silence and solitude. Luther had been the greatest warrior on Caliban before the Lion arrived. He had been the leader, the hero, the man to whom all others looked for guidance. And then, in what must have felt like the blink of an eye, he had been eclipsed. The Lion was everything Luther had been, magnified 1,000-fold by the genetic engineering of the Emperor. Luther could not compete with a Primarch. No human could. But the knowledge that his own inadequacy was a product of biology rather than character did nothing to ease the sting. If anything, it made it worse. Luther had not been found wanting through any failure of will or courage. He had simply been born mortal. Yes, and mortality was a cage that no amount of surgical enhancement could fully escape. The bitterness accumulated like sediment in still water. Each new victory that reached Caliban from the front lines of the Great Crusade was another reminder of what Luther was missing. Each fresh batch of recruits that shipped out to join the Lions campaigns was another group of warriors who would know the glory that Luther had been denied. And the Dark Angels who had been sent back to Caliban alongside Luther, whether as punishment or assignment, shared in his growing resentment. Many of them were Calibanite-born, warriors who remembered the old days before the Emperor came, and they felt the same sense of displacement and abandonment that gnawed at Luther's soul. Meanwhile, something else was happening beneath Caliban's surface. The warp taint that had created the great beasts had never truly been eradicated. The Lions campaign had killed the beasts themselves. Yes, but the corruption that had spawned them lingered in the planet's bedrock like a cancer in remission. Unknown to anyone at the time, an entity called the Ouroboros was embedded in Caliban's core, a device or being of immense power that served as the source of the world's warp contamination. Its influence seeped upward through the stone, whispering to those who were vulnerable, offering power and understanding to those whose hearts were already darkened by resentment. Luther listened, and in listening, he began to change. That darkness would consume everything. It would destroy a world. It would shatter a legion. And it would create the conditions for one of the most enduring mysteries in the entire galaxy. The mystery of Cypher. But before we can understand Cypher, we need to understand the title itself. Because Cypher is not a name. It never was. It is an office, a role, a mantle that was passed from one keeper to the next across the generations. And the purpose of that office tells us something crucial about what the being who carries that title today might actually want. So let us begin there. Let us talk about the Lord Cypher of the Order and the sacred duty that was entrusted to the one who bore that name. To understand the title of Lord Cypher, you have to understand something fundamental about the culture of Caliban before the Emperor arrived. These were not primitive savages huddling in caves. As the people of Caliban had built a civilization, rough and feudal as it was, that placed enormous value on tradition, honor, and the preservation of knowledge. They had to. Living on a death world meant that every generation fought to survive against threats that could wipe out an entire settlement in a single night. The customs and practices that had kept humanity alive on Caliban for thousands of years were not mere ceremonies. They were survival mechanisms. Every ritual, every tradition, in every protocol had been paid for in blood, refined over centuries of desperate struggle against the darkness. The knightly orders understood this better than anyone, and the order, the greatest of them all, took the preservation of tradition more seriously than any other duty. They believed, with a conviction that bordered on religious fervor, that the moment they allowed their standards to slip, the moment they forgot why they did things the way they did, the beasts would win. Or civilization would fall. Humanity on Caliban would be extinguished. So they created the office of Lord Cypher. The title was given to a single knight, chosen in secret by the ruling masters of the order. The selection process itself was shrouded in mystery. The other knights would not know who had been chosen until the ceremony was already complete. And what a ceremony it was. The chosen knight was required to renounce everything. His name was stricken from the records. His personal history was erased. His face was hidden beneath a cloak and hood, and from that day forward, no one was permitted to acknowledge his former identity. He ceased to exist as an individual. In his place stood something else entirely. The Lord Cypher was not a person. He was an embodiment, a living representation of the Order's laws, customs, and disciplines. His duty was to ensure that those traditions were maintained without compromise, as that the recruits and masters alike never strayed from the ideals that had kept humanity alive on Caliban for millennia. He advised the masters on all matters of protocol. He officiated at the most important ceremonies. He was the conscience of the order, the guardian of its soul, and he carried the weight of every tradition that had come before him on his shoulders. Think about that for a moment. A man who gives up his name, his face, his very identity, all so that he can become the living embodiment of an ideal. There is something beautiful about that sacrifice, and something deeply unsettling about it too. Because when you strip away everything that makes a person who they are, what is left? What happens to the man beneath the hood? Does he disappear entirely, subsumed into the role? Or does some fragment of his original self persist, watching from behind the mask, waiting for the moment when it can reassert itself? That question has haunted the Dark Angels for 10,000 years, because the being who carries the title of Lord Cypher in the current Millennium embodies many of the ancient tenets of the original office. He moves in shadows. He conceals his identity. He seems driven by some purpose that no one else can comprehend. But whether that purpose is the preservation of something sacred or its destruction, nobody can say with certainty. The Order took the position of Lord Cypher extremely seriously. They understood, with a wisdom born of millennia of struggle, that it was the nature of the galaxy to corrode. Structures collapse, ideals fade. The entropy of the universe works against order and meaning with a relentless patience that no fortress can withstand forever. The Lord Cypher was their answer to that entropy, a human firewall against the slow decay of everything they held dear. When the Emperor came to Caliban and the knightly orders were absorbed into the Dark Angels' Legion, the title of Lord Cypher persisted. It adapted, as all such traditions do, to the new reality of the Space Marine Legion. The Lord Cypher continued to serve as the keeper of secrets and traditions, though now those traditions included the practices of the Dark Angels themselves, blended with the ancient customs of Caliban's knightly heritage. It was a role that bridged two worlds, one foot in the feudal past and one in the superhuman present. And it was a role that at least 3 different individuals are known to have held before the Horus heresy tore the galaxy apart. The first was an elderly human, a knight of the Order who served as Lord Cypher during the campaign against the great beasts. He advised both Luther and the Lion during that golden age of unification, and he passed away a few years after the Emperor arrived on Caliban. His was a quiet death, the end of a life dedicated to service. And his successor would prove to be far more consequential. The second Lord Cypher was younger, a mortal human who came to the position before the full transformation of the Order into the Dark Angels. He later underwent the surgical procedures to become a full space marine during the recruitment period that followed the Imperium's discovery of Caliban. And it is here that the mystery truly begins to deepen. Because there are rumors about this second Lord Cypher that refuse to die no matter how many centuries pass. Rumors that connect him to another knightly order, one with a far darker purpose than defending humanity from the great beasts. The Knights of Lupus. Now here is where the story takes a turn into shadows so deep that even the most determined investigators have struggled to find solid ground. The Knights of Lupus were one of Caliban's many knightly orders, but they were unlike any of the others. Where most orders existed to protect humanity from the great beasts, the Knights of Lupus had a different relationship with those monsters entirely. They studied them. They collected knowledge about them. They sought to understand the forces that had created them, the dark energies that warped flesh and twisted bone into shapes that nightmares could not improve upon. In doing so, the Knights of Lupus stumbled upon something that would not be given a proper name for thousands of years. They found chaos, not the chaos of gods and demons, not the full cosmic horror that the Emperor had built his entire Imperium to oppose, but the echoes of it. The fingerprints left behind on Caliban's surface by whatever warp entity had tainted the world in ages past. The planet's forests were not merely dangerous. They were corrupted at a fundamental level, the very woods saturated with psychic residue that warped everything it touched. The great beasts were not natural predators. They were living manifestations of that corruption, flesh and bone, twisted into shapes that no natural evolutionary process could have produced. The Knights of Lupus understood this, or at least they understood enough of it to be afraid and fascinated in equal measure. They studied the corruption's patterns. They mapped its concentrations. They catalogued its effects on living tissue and on the environment. And in doing so, they accumulated a body of knowledge that was simultaneously invaluable and incredibly dangerous. They were, in a sense, the first chaos scholars on Caliban, researchers who peered into the abyss and allowed the abyss to peer back into them. Their library was extensive, filled with texts that described the properties of warp energy in terms that the knightly orders of Caliban had no proper language to express. Some of these texts would later find their way into Luther's hands, and their contents would contribute directly to his fall from grace. The forbidden knowledge that the Knights of Lupus had accumulated was like a loaded weapon left lying on the ground. It was only a matter of time before someone picked it up and pulled the trigger. The Knights of Lupus gathered this knowledge, preserved it, studied it in secret, and they became something that was not quite a knightly order anymore. They became a cult. When Lionel Johnson unified the knightly orders and led the campaign to eradicate the great beasts, the Knights of Lupus resisted. They saw the lions purge not as salvation, but as destruction, the annihilation of the very things they had dedicated their lives to understanding. The lion showed them no mercy. He destroyed the Knights of Lupus utterly, wiping them from the face of Caliban as thoroughly as he had wiped out the great beasts. And every member was hunted down and slain. Every fortress was razed. Every scrap of their accumulated knowledge was put to the torch. Every member, that is, except one. According to two members of the order, a knight named Sardaviel and a master called Remiel, a single survivor of the Knights of Lupus managed to escape the destruction of his order. A young knight, the newest and youngest of their number, or who somehow slipped through the lion's dragnet and made his way into the ranks of the order under a false name. He rose through the ranks with startling speed, demonstrating abilities and knowledge that should have been far beyond his years, and eventually, through means that remain unclear, he was chosen to become the new Lord Cypher. Think about what that means. If this account is true, then the keeper of the order's most sacred traditions, the guardian of its very soul, was a spy. A plant. They're the secret agent of a chaos-tainted cult embedded at the highest levels of the organization he was supposed to protect. Every ritual he officiated, every piece of advice he gave the masters, every tradition he claimed to preserve, all of it potentially corrupted from the moment he donned the hood and cloak. But here is where the story becomes even more complicated. Later sources, particularly the novel Angels of Caliban, paint a very different picture of this second Lord Cypher. In that account, the Lord Cypher is portrayed not as a servant of chaos, but as an ally of the Watchers in the Dark, those mysterious, diminutive beings who had inhabited Caliban's forests since before humanity arrived on the planet. The Watchers were powerful, enigmatic creatures whose motives were largely inscrutable, but they were consistently depicted as enemies of chaos, not servants of it. If the Lord Cypher was working with the Watchers, yes, then perhaps his origins among the Knights of Lupus were not what they seemed. Perhaps he had been placed within the order not to corrupt it, but to protect it from the very corruption his former order had uncovered. Furthermore, when the librarian Zahariel encountered this Lord Cypher and removed his helm, he recognized the face beneath. This detail makes it unlikely that Cypher was truly a former Knight of Lupus in disguise, since Zahariel would have had no reason to recognize someone from a rival order that had been destroyed before his time. The true identity of this second Lord Cypher remains one of the great unsolved puzzles of Dark Angel's history, and it was this Lord Cypher who would play a crucial role in the events leading up to the greatest catastrophe in the history of the First Legion. One, because while the Lion was away fighting the Great Crusade and then navigating the treacherous waters of the Horus Heresy, Luther was on Caliban, and Luther was changing. Now we need to talk about Zahariel, because his story is inseparable from the mystery of Cypher. In many ways, Zahariel El-Zurius, is the thread that connects the ancient past of Caliban to the enigmatic figure who wanders the galaxy in the current millennium. Understanding who he was, what he did, and what he might have become is essential to grasping even a fraction of the puzzle that Cypher represents. Zahariel was born on Caliban in the years before the Emperor's arrival. He left home at the age of 7 to attempt to join the Order, accompanied by his cousin Nemiel. Both boys succeeded in becoming supplicants, and both were plunged into the intensive training program that would consume nearly every waking moment of their lives for years to come. Al-Zahariel was remarkable even among the remarkable. He possessed psychic abilities that set him apart from his peers, a connection to the warp that allowed him to perceive things that others could not, and to wield powers that the people of Caliban had no framework to understand. He fought in the campaign against the great beasts. He witnessed the coming of the Emperor. He underwent the transformation into a full space marine, becoming one of the Dark Angels of the First Legion. And then, as like Luther, he was sent back to Caliban. The circumstances of his reassignment remain unclear. Some accounts suggest that it was related to an incident during the campaign against the Soroshi, an alien civilization whose leaders had attempted to assassinate Lionel Johnson. Luther had known about the assassination attempt and had briefly hesitated before acting to stop it, and Zahariel had been present for that moment of weakness. Whether the Lions suspected Zahariel of divided loyalties or simply needed reliable officers on Caliban is impossible to determine at this distance. What matters is that Zahariel was on Caliban when everything fell apart. 50 years passed, 50 years of isolation, of watching the galaxy tear itself apart from the sidelines, of receiving fragmentary news from a war that seemed to grow more terrible with each passing day. The Horus heresy erupted across the galaxy, tearing the Imperium in half, and half of the Emperor's sons, the demigod Primarchs, who were supposed to be the pillars of the Imperium, had turned traitor. Legions that had fought together as brothers now butchered each other across the width and breadth of the galaxy. Worlds burned, civilizations fell. The dream of the Great Crusade, the promise of a united humanity spreading across the stars under the banner of reason and progress, died in the flames of brother war. And on Caliban, and afar from the great battles that were reshaping the fate of humanity, a different kind of rebellion was brewing. Luther, consumed by bitterness and jealousy, had begun to dabble in forbidden knowledge. The dark forces that had always lurked beneath Caliban's surface, the same forces that had created the great beasts, began to whisper to him. They offered power. They offered understanding. They offered revenge against the friend who had cast him aside. Luther's fall was not sudden. It was a slow descent, a gradual erosion of principle that took place over decades. Each step seemed small, each compromise seemed justified, and by the time Luther realized how far he had fallen, the ground beneath him had already given way. He was aided in this descent by Terran-born bureaucrats who had been sent to Caliban as part of the Imperium's administrative apparatus. What no one on Caliban realized was that many of these officials were chaos cultists, as agents of the dark powers who had been planted specifically to exploit the resentment and isolation of the Caliban garrison. They whispered the right words to the right people. They fanned the flames of discontent. They created the conditions for rebellion while appearing to be nothing more than petty functionaries doing their jobs. Luther declared Caliban independent from the Imperium. He was not aligned with Horus, not exactly. His rebellion was something more personal, more complicated. But he believed he was protecting Caliban from a galaxy that had gone mad, but the corruption was already deep in his bones. The warp taint that had always been present on Caliban was growing stronger, and Luther was drinking from that poisoned well with increasing desperation. He spoke of mastering the secrets the Emperor had tried to conceal, of wielding the power of the warp for Caliban's defense. He did not see that he was becoming the very thing the Emperor had sought to protect humanity from. During this period, the Lord Cypher served as one of Luther's advisors. The exact nature of his advice, and whether it was intended to guide Luther toward damnation or away from it, remains one of the great debates among scholars of this era. What we do know is that things came to a violent head during a coup attempt. The Lord Cypher tried to kill Zahariel. The attempt failed. Zahariel fought back, and the Lord Cypher fell. Luther, either impressed by Zahariel's survival or simply in need of a replacement for the fallen Lord Cypher, promoted the librarian to the vacant position. Zahariel el-Zurias became the new Lord Cypher. This is a critical moment in the story, and it is worth pausing here to consider its implications. Zahariel was a powerful psyker, one of the most gifted librarians in the Dark Angels Legion. He had a confirmed connection to the Watchers in the Dark, as those enigmatic beings who had aided the Lion himself on multiple occasions. He was a librarian who had joined a rebellion against the Imperium, but who was not aligned with Horus or any of the traitor legions. He was a man of divided loyalties, caught between his duty to the Emperor and his love for Caliban, between his revulsion at what Luther was becoming and his understanding of why Luther felt the way he did. If Zahariel is the Cypher who roams the galaxy in the 41st millennium, and there is considerable evidence to suggest that he might be, then suddenly his impossible-to-categorize behavior starts to make a certain kind of sense. A being who fights for the Imperium one day and against it the next. A warrior who has been seen alongside Chaos forces and Imperial forces in equal measure. A man who carries a broken sword that he has never drawn, seeking to present it before the Emperor and gain forgiveness for sins committed 10,000 years ago. Yet that is exactly the kind of behavior you would expect from someone who never fully belonged to either side, who has spent millennia trying to fulfill some mission that transcends the simple binary of loyalty and betrayal. During his most recent capture by the Dark Angels, Cypher spoke a single code word: Starfire. That word carried enormous significance. Because it was the code word that had been used to activate the orbital defense weapons against Lionel Johnson's fleet when the Primarch returned to Caliban at the end of the Horus heresy. That code word was originally known to only 4 people: Luther, Astalan, Grifain, and Zahariel. The fact that Cypher knew it suggests strongly that he was one of those 4 individuals. Luther has been a prisoner of the Dark Angels for 10,000 years, and Astalan and Grifain's fates account for them in other ways. That leaves Zahariel. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before we can talk about Cypher's millennia-long journey across the galaxy, we need to talk about the event that created him. The event that shattered a world, scattered a legion, and planted the seed of a shame so deep that an entire chapter of Space Marines has spent 10,000 years trying to bury it. We need to talk about the fall of Caliban. The end came swiftly, though the seeds of it had been growing for decades. When the Horus heresy reached its terrible conclusion with the death of Horus and the near-fatal wounding of the Emperor on the bridge of the War Master's flagship, the loyal legions began the long process of returning to their homeworlds. Lionel Johnson, racked with grief over the fate of his father and burning with shame that he had arrived too late to defend Terra, brought his fleet back to Caliban. Yet what he found there broke something inside him that could never be repaired. As the Dark Angel's fleet moved into orbit, the planet's defense batteries opened fire. Lance strikes and torpedo salvos screamed upward from the surface, slamming into the warships of the First Legion with devastating force. Ships burned. Ships died. The Lion, stunned and bewildered, pulled his fleet back and tried to understand what was happening. A merchant vessel in the system provided the answer. Luther had turned. Luther had taken the garrison, the new recruits, the veterans left behind to train them, and he had turned them all against the Lion, against the Emperor, against everything they had once sworn to protect. The truth was more complicated than that, as truth always is. Not everyone on Caliban had willingly followed Luther into rebellion. Many of the Dark Angels on the planet's surface were completely unaware of what was happening. They did not know who had fired first or why. Yet they only knew that they were under orbital bombardment from their own brothers, and they fought back with the desperate fury of warriors who believed they were defending themselves from a baseless attack. The fog of war was absolute, And in that confusion, brother killed brother without ever understanding the reasons. The lion's rage was a terrible thing. He ordered a systematic bombardment of the planet's surface, reducing the fortress monasteries to rubble, burning the forests that had been Caliban's defining feature for as long as anyone could remember. The very surface of the planet began to crack under the strain. Tectonic plates shifted, continents buckled. Caliban was tearing itself apart. And at the heart of it all, in the ruins of the Order's original fortress monastery, the Lion and Luther met for the last time. The Chaos Gods had elevated Luther to something approaching the Lion's own level of power. In their duel leveled the monastery around them, a titanic clash between two men who had once been the closest of friends. The Lion could not bring himself to strike the killing blow when Luther stumbled and fell. And in that moment of hesitation, Luther unleashed a psychic attack of staggering power that left the Primarch mortally wounded. And then, like a curtain being torn away, the madness lifted from Luther's eyes. He saw what he had done. He saw his friend, his brother, or the wild boy he had found in the forest all those years ago, lying broken at his feet. The weight of his betrayal crashed down upon him like a collapsing mountain, and Luther's mind shattered. He fell to the floor, weeping, unable to fight anymore. But it was too late. Far, far too late. The Chaos Gods, seeing that their chosen instrument had failed, sent a massive warp storm to engulf Caliban. The planet, already cracking apart from the orbital bombardment, it could not withstand the additional assault. It broke. The world that had been the cradle of the Dark Angels, the world where the Lion had grown to manhood and the Order had stood against the darkness for millennia, simply ceased to exist. All that remained was a fragment of rock, the core of the fortress monastery, preserved by powerful void shields. This fragment would become the Rock, the mobile fortress monastery of the Dark Angels chapter. A broken shard of a broken world carrying the shattered dreams of a broken legion through the void. Imagine what it must have looked like from orbit. A world cracking apart like an egg, its tectonic plates separating and tumbling into the void, its atmosphere peeling away in streamers of gas and fire. The forests that had defined Caliban for as long as anyone could remember, burning and then freezing as they were exposed to the vacuum. But the fortress monasteries that had sheltered humanity for generations, crumbling into rubble and then into dust. Mountains that had stood for geological ages, splitting apart and spinning away into darkness. All of it consumed by the warp storm that swirled around the dying world, like a predator circling wounded prey. And in the eye of that storm, a single fragment of stone, protected by force fields that burned with a defiant light against the surrounding destruction. The monastery of the Order. Of the Rock, the last piece of Caliban that would survive to carry the memory of what had been lost. But the warp storm did something else, something that would echo across the next 10,000 years. It seized the fallen, those dark angels who had sided with Luther, and it scattered them, not just through space, but through time itself. The eddies of the warp cast them across the galaxy like seeds on a hurricane wind. Some arrived in real space moments after being pulled from Caliban's surface, as only to find that millennia had passed. Others spent what felt like ages enduring the torments of the warp, only to emerge back into reality within seconds of the planet's destruction. The chronological scattering was complete and utterly chaotic. There are even fallen who have not yet been released back into the galaxy, trapped in the warp for eternity, experiencing torments beyond mortal comprehension, waiting to be spat out at some future point that may never come. And here is a detail that defies comprehension, one that adds another layer of madness to an already insane story.
Honestly, this is what keeps me coming back to Cypher as a character. I have covered a lot of lore on this channel, a lot of tragic figures, and a lot of larger-than-life heroes and villains. But Cypher hits different because Games Workshop has resisted the urge to just explain him. They have let the mystery breathe for decades now, real-world decades, and that takes restraint. Most writers would have cracked by now and given us a definitive answer. Is he loyal? Is he a traitor? what is the sword for, but they haven't. And personally, I think that is the right call, because the moment you answer those questions, Cypher becomes just another character. Right now, he's something more than that. He's a feeling, that uneasy sensation you get when you realize the person you have been calling a villain might actually be the only one trying to fix things. And I genuinely think he's one of the best written characters in all of 40k. And I don't say that lightly. But anyways, that's just my opinion. Let me know what you guys think, and let's go back to the video.
The warp storm that scattered the fallen was not caused by the chaos gods in the past. It was caused in the future. Specifically, it was caused by the clash between Astalan, Typhus, Azrael, and Cypher 10,000 years later, when their conflict over the two-culture engine, a device capable of creating bridges through time, has created the very warp storm that had originally scattered the fallen. The cause came after the effect. The future created the past. Time, in the presence of the warp and the machinations of beings who operate outside normal causality, becomes a serpent eating its own tail. Cypher, whether he intended it or not, may have been partially responsible for the very catastrophe that created him. The Lord Cypher, or perhaps someone impersonating him, was among those scattered fallen. Whether this was Zahariel, or the previous Lord Cypher somehow surviving, or someone else entirely, no one knows for certain. What is known is that when the Dark Angels descended to the asteroid that was all that remained of their home, they found Luther. He was alive, but his mind was gone. He could only mumble the same words over and over, that the lion had been taken by the Watchers in the dark, and that one day he would return to forgive Luther for his sins. Of the lion there was no sign. The surviving Dark Angels made a decision that would define their chapter for the next 10 millennia. They would bury the truth. They would hide the shame of their betrayal from the wider Imperium, from the other chapters, from the Inquisition, from everyone. Only the highest-ranking members of the chapter, the Inner Circle, would ever know what had really happened on Caliban. And they would dedicate themselves, with an obsession that bordered on madness, just to hunting down every single one of the fallen and making them repent for their treachery. This is the secret that drives the Dark Angels. This is the wound that never heals. And Cypher is the salt that someone keeps rubbing into it. The Dark Angels and their successor chapters call themselves the Unforgiven. It is a name that carries within it the full weight of 10,000 years of guilt, shame, and desperate secrecy. As long as a single fallen angel remains alive and unrepentant somewhere in the galaxy, the Dark Angels cannot consider their penance complete. They cannot forgive themselves for what happened on Caliban. They cannot rest. This obsession has shaped every aspect of the chapter's organization and behavior. The Deathwing, the chapter's first company of Terminator-armored veterans, exists primarily as a hunting force dedicated to tracking down the fallen. The Ravenwing, of the second company of rapid assault specialists, serves as the scouts and outriders of that eternal hunt. And the Inner Circle, the shadowy hierarchy of command that extends across all of the Unforgiven successor chapters, coordinates the effort with a secrecy that has aroused the suspicion of the Inquisition on more than one occasion. When a fallen angel is located, the Dark Angels will abandon whatever mission they are currently engaged in to pursue him. They will divert fleets, while break alliances, and sacrifice strategic objectives without hesitation or explanation if the chance to capture one of their traitorous brethren presents itself. They have been known to purge entire populations to ensure that the secret of the fallen never reaches the ears of outsiders. They have killed Imperial servants, including members of the Inquisition, who got too close to the truth. On more than one occasion, the Dark Angels have abandoned allies in the middle of a battle, thus withdrawing their forces without explanation or apology, because a lead on a fallen angel was deemed more important than the strategic objective they had been assigned. This behavior has earned them a reputation for unreliability among other Imperial institutions, and the Inquisition has opened multiple investigations into the chapter's activities over the millennia, though none have ever penetrated deep enough to uncover the truth. The structure of the Inner Circle itself is a marvel of compartmentalized secrecy. It extends across all of the Unforgiven successor chapters, creating a shadow hierarchy that operates parallel to the official chain of command. At the lowest level, newly elevated members of the Death Wing learn only that some of their brethren turned traitor during the Horus heresy. As they rise through the ranks, they learn more, each revelation more terrible than the last, each secret adding another weight to the burden of guilt that defines the Dark Angel's existence. The Supreme Grand Master of the Dark Angels, currently Azrael, knows more than anyone except perhaps the chaplains who tend to Luther's cell in the deepest dungeons of the rock. Even among the unforgiven, knowledge is parceled out in carefully measured doses, each piece of the truth given only to those who have proven they can bear its weight. Yet the interrogation of captured fallen is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire enterprise. The interrogator chaplains are specialists in extracting confessions, trained in methods of physical and psychological persuasion that have been refined over 10 millennia of practice. Their chambers in the depths of the rock are places of absolute darkness and absolute pain, where the boundaries between flesh and will are tested to their breaking point and beyond. The fallen are not merely tortured for information. They are broken, systematically and completely, until they acknowledge their betrayal, confess their sins, and beg for forgiveness. Only then are they granted the release of death. The captured fallen are brought to the dungeons deep beneath the rock, where the interrogator chaplains subject them to methods of persuasion that would make the most hardened torturer flinch. The goal is not punishment, at least not primarily. The goal is repentance. The Dark Angels need the fallen to confess their sins, to acknowledge their betrayal, to speak the words that might, in some small way, begin to wash the stain from the chapter's honor. Those who repent are granted death, the Emperor's peace, administered as a mercy after the agony of confession. Those who refuse to repent die anyway, but more slowly. It is a grim business, ugly and brutal, and it has been going on for 10,000 years. The Dark Angels will never stop. But they cannot stop. Their shame will not allow it. And through all of this, Cypher has been the one fallen who simply will not be caught. The Dark Angels have claimed kills on Cypher multiple times over the millennia. They have reported his destruction, celebrated his elimination, and added his name to the rolls of the neutralized. And every single time he has reappeared. Sometimes within months, sometimes within years, sometimes within decades, but he always comes back. This pattern of death and resurrection, if that is what it is, has driven the inner circle to something approaching despair. They have developed theories to explain it. That Cypher is not one person but many. That he is a title passed between agents. That the Chaos Gods resurrect him each time he falls. That the Watchers in the dark intervene to preserve him. That he possesses some form of temporal manipulation that allows him to avoid fatal outcomes by simply not being present at the moment of his death. The Red Corsairs, the Chaos Warband that once controlled a vast pirate empire in the Maelstrom, also thought they had cornered Cypher at one point. They tracked him to a strike cruiser called the Rapier and halted the vessel in the deep emptiness of interstellar space. When they boarded, they found only Chaos cultists. Cypher himself was gone. Not hidden aboard the ship, not concealed in a stasis chamber or a secret compartment, simply gone, as though he had stepped through a door that no one else could see and closed it behind him. The cultists could offer no explanation. The Red Corsairs could find no trace. It was as if the laws of physics had momentarily relaxed their grip to allow one very specific individual to be somewhere other than where he was supposed to be. From the very beginning, from the first time his distinctive signal was identified by the unforgiven, Cypher was different. He was not like the other fallen, who scattered to the corners of the galaxy and tried to build new lives for themselves, some as warlords, some as hermits, some falling deeper into the embrace of chaos. Cypher had a purpose. He moved with deliberation. His appearances were not random, no matter how chaotic they seemed on the surface. There was a pattern, a plan, a thread of intention running through his actions that the inner circle could sense but never quite grasp. And nowhere was this more evident than in the catastrophic series of events known as the Forgotten Wars. The Forgotten Wars are among the most closely guarded secrets in the Dark Angel's already secretive history. Even within the chapter, knowledge of these events is restricted to the highest members of the inner circle. The official records have been expunged. The name of an entire successor chapter has been erased from Imperial archives, and at the center of it all, like a spider at the heart of a web, was Cypher. It began in the year 580 of the 31st Millennium, barely a generation after the destruction of Caliban. Elements of the Angels of Vengeance, one of the Dark Angel's successor chapters, were operating in the Gothic sector under the pretext of hunting down remnants of an orc fleet. In reality, as was standard procedure for all Unforgiven chapters, they were using the mission as cover to search for traces of the fallen. This dual-purpose approach to warfare was something the Unforgiven had perfected over the centuries, fulfilling their obligations to the High Lords of Terror while secretly pursuing their own agenda. During their sweep of the sector, the Angels of Vengeance detected an encrypted signal emanating from the mining world of Lemnos. The signal was peculiar, coded in a way that suggested origins predating the heresy. A strike team was dispatched to investigate, and what they found was a fallen angel who had been operating under the alias of the Mauler. The capture was successful, though it came at a high cost in casualties. The Mauler was brought to the Rock and subjected to the tender ministrations of the interrogator chaplains. Under interrogation, the Mauler revealed his true name. Brother Cytrex, a dark angel, returned to the fold. Before he was finally granted the mercy of death, Cytrex provided something invaluable. He named a dozen other fallen that he had encountered in the sector. The hunt was on. Acting on Cytrex's intelligence, elements of the Dark Angels, the Angels of Vengeance, and the Lion Sable, another of the Unforgiven successor chapters, deployed strike teams ranging from a few squads to full companies across the Gothic sector. They tracked down fallen one by one, capturing some and killing those who resisted. But there was one target that eluded them consistently, one signal that they detected again and again, always just ahead of their pursuit, always slipping through their fingers at the last moment. It was the first recorded encounter with the unique signal patterns that would later be identified as belonging to Cypher. The chase stretched from years into decades. The trail led the Unforgiven to a densely populated world called Brigia, but where a fallen angel had risen to become the commander of the Planetary Defense Force under the name Grand Captain Tylius. Tylius had been in contact with Cypher, and he was wary. He knew he was being hunted. He remained within Brigia's most formidable fortress system, surrounded by an entire army acting as his personal bodyguard. Supreme Grandmaster Person, the leader of the Dark Angels at the time, gathered every available Unforgiven asset within range. The Angels of Redemption and the Lions, Sable, answered the summons. They launched a precision assault on the fortress, using drop pods, land speeder formations, and bunker-busting dreadnoughts to crack the outer defenses. Lance strikes from land speeder formations kept the defenders on the ramparts pinned down and eliminated key bunker-mounted gun turrets. With precision timing and deadly accuracy, the Unforgiven made headway through the outermost defenses, working their way inward toward the central keep where Tylius was hidden. They were poised for the second phase of the operation, the final assault, when something unexpected happened. The records do not specify exactly what occurred, but the operation was disrupted. Cypher's involvement is suspected, as it so often is when carefully laid plans fall apart at the worst possible moment. Tylius escaped, or was allowed to escape, and the trail continued deeper into the Gothic sector, whilst the chase stretched on for years, then decades, drawing the Unforgiven further and further from safe Imperial space. It was as though Cypher was leading them, drawing them forward step by step, like a fisherman playing a line, giving just enough slack to keep the prey following before pulling taut again. The trail eventually led to the very edge of the Eye of Terror itself. This was dangerous ground, territory that no sane commander would enter voluntarily. Yet the Eye of Terror is not merely a warp storm. It is a wound in the fabric of reality, a place where the material universe and the immaterium overlap. where the laws of physics break down and the nightmares of the warp bleed into real space. Ships that enter the Eye rarely return. Those that do come back with crews, driven mad by what they have witnessed, their holds filled with corruption, and their logs recording impossible events that defy rational explanation. Supreme Grandmaster Person, one driven by the same obsessive need to capture the fallen that has defined every Dark Angel's leader since the destruction of Caliban, ordered a task force to enter the Eye of Terror. It was a decision born of desperation and duty in equal measure. The shame of the fallen burned in Person's hearts, as surely as it had burned in the hearts of every Supreme Grandmaster before him, and the opportunity to locate and destroy a concentration of traitors was too valuable to pass up, regardless of the risks. A single strike cruiser, the Lion Sable's Fury of Caliban, was sent into the swirling madness, carrying companies from the Dark Angels, the Angels of Vengeance, the Angels of Redemption, and the Lion's Sable. The vessel emerged in real space near a planet designated Cocytus 1, a world that orbited so close to the Eye of Terror that it was periodically consumed by warp storms before being spat out again. What they found on that blasted, mist-shrouded rock was a nightmare. As the surface was largely barren, its rocky terrain scarred by exposure to the raw energies of the warp. And there, rising from the desolation, stood a great tower covered in the symbols and heraldry of the Dark Angels. It was a den of fallen, a concentration of traitors unlike anything the Unforgiven had encountered since the destruction of Caliban itself. When Cypher's distinctive signal was detected on the planet's surface, Person made his decision that he ordered a full-scale assault and called for reinforcements. The reinforcements came. Half of the Dark Angels chapter, the entire Angels of Redemption, 3 companies of the Angels of Vengeance, and the complete strength of the Lion's Sable descended upon Cocytus 1 with the fury of warriors who had waited centuries for this moment. The battle raged across the wasteland continents of both Cocytus 1 and its twin, Cocytus 2. The Unforgiven raised den after den of cultists, mutants, and renegades, as pressing ever deeper into the corrupted landscape. But the corruption was growing worse. Warp storms began to form over the twin planets, swirling and expanding with a malevolent hunger that threatened to swallow everything. Cypher, it is said, warned Person that it was a trap. Person ignored him. What happened next was catastrophic. The warp storms closed in, consuming Cocytus 1 and its twin. The Lion's Sable, who had committed their entire chapter to the assault, refused to retreat. They insisted on staying to destroy the fallen, to complete the mission even as reality itself was being torn apart around them. Supreme Grandmaster Person was with them. None of them were ever seen again. The remaining Unforgiven forces fought their way out of the Eye of Terror, escaping through the Cadian Gate under cover of the impenetrable murk thrown up by the warp storms. They were dismayed to discover, upon their return to the rock, that although they had been gone for what felt like only a few years inside the storms, in real space over 1,000 years had passed. Let that sink in for a moment. Warriors who had left on a mission expecting to return within months or years emerged to find that centuries had turned to millennia. Every person they had known outside of the expedition was long dead. The Imperium they had left behind had evolved and changed in ways they could not have predicted. The political landscape, the military situation, the very culture of the chapters they served, had shifted beneath them like sand under a receding tide. They were strangers in their own galaxy, displaced in time by the capricious nature of the warp, returning to a future that had no place for them, except as curiosities to be studied and secrets to be buried. The psychological toll of temporal displacement is something that is rarely discussed in the lore, but it deserves consideration here. Imagine being a warrior who entered the Eye of Terror in the 31st millennium, fully expecting to return to a galaxy you understood, to brothers you knew by name, to a chain of command that you trusted, and instead you emerge over 1,000 years later into a galaxy that has moved on without you, where everything is simultaneously familiar and completely alien. The architecture is different. The customs have evolved. The equipment has changed. New chapters have been founded, and old ones have been destroyed. Heroes whose names you do not recognize are venerated in halls that were not built when you left. Your own name has been erased from the records because the chapter you served has gone to extraordinary lengths to pretend that your mission never happened. The Lion's Sable were gone. An entire successor chapter of the Dark Angels wiped from existence. Supreme Grandmaster Person was gone. The sacred artifacts he had carried. And the Sword of Secrets and the Lion Helm, the two most potent symbols of the Dark Angel's authority, were lost. And then Cypher reappeared. His telltale signal was detected in the same system as the rock. Hunt teams were scrambled immediately. They pursued Cypher to a ruined and desolate planet, tracking his signal to an empty cathedral dedicated to the Emperor. And there, neatly placed where they could not possibly be missed, they found the Sword of Secrets and the Lion Helm, at the most precious relics of the Dark Angels, returned as casually as if someone were returning a borrowed book. Whether this was a trap or a test, the Unforgiven have never been able to determine. What they do know is that the Forgotten Wars cost them dearly. The losses were horrific, and the shame of losing an entire successor chapter was added to the already crushing weight of their existing guilt. The Dark Angels went to extraordinary lengths to cover up what had happened. They sabotaged their own fortress monastery's records, claiming that a plasma reactor overload had destroyed their archives. They seized the recruiting world of the Lion's Sable, the Dark Orb of Nachtwald, and used its resources to replenish the Angels of Vengeance and the Angels of Retribution. The survivors of Cocytus who eventually returned were spread across the Unforgiven chapters so that their sudden appearance would not attract attention, and each was monitored by company chaplains for the rest of their lives to ensure that prolonged warp exposure had not contaminated them. Of the Forgotten Wars, the Dark Angels do not speak, yet their custom and battle cry is, "Never forget, never forgive." The irony is not lost on those who know the full story. And Cypher? Cypher continued to walk the galaxy, his trail winding through the centuries like a river through a valley, touching everything and belonging to nothing. Yet the 10,000 years between the Forgotten Wars and the present day are filled with Cypher's appearances, each one more inexplicable than the last. He emerges from the shadows, does something that seems to make no sense to anyone except himself, and then vanishes again. His trail of confirmed actions reads like the resume of the most unpredictable operative in galactic history, a resume that spans entire geological ages of human civilization. But to understand the sheer scope of Cypher's activities, consider that he has been active across all 5 segmentums of the Imperium. His signal has been detected in systems separated by tens of thousands of light years. He has appeared on worlds in the galactic core and on worlds at the very fringes of Imperial space. He has operated in the shadow of the Eye of Terror and in the calm backwaters of the Ultima Segmentum. No region of the galaxy is safe from his attention, and no distance seems to present an obstacle to his movement. How a single individual, even a space marine, manages to traverse such vast distances without the resources of a chapter or a fleet behind him is one of the many unexplained aspects of his existence. He does not always work alone. At times, Cypher seems to attract other members of the Fallen to his side. They appear around him like iron filings drawn to a magnet, or gathering from across the galaxy through some means of communication that no one has been able to identify or intercept. Whether Cypher summons them, or whether they are simply drawn to his presence by some inexplicable force is unclear, but it is too consistent to be coincidence. Where Cypher walks, other dangerous elements follow, and the violence that erupts in his wake is rarely accidental. Cypher's trail also has a strange habit of crossing paths with the Dark Angels in ways that seem deliberate. After slaying an orc warboss called the Overfiend Tyrannex, riddling him with holes, and leaving behind bolt shell fragments and unique plasma burns that were unmistakably the signature of Cypher's weapons, he had the audacity to plant a Dark Angel's homing device at the scene. Within hours, the rock was nearby, and Deathwing Terminators teleported into the Overfiend's throne room. But of Cypher, there was no trace. He had killed their enemy, left them a calling card, and vanished before they could arrive. Was he helping them, mocking them, testing them? All three at once? In the year 822 of the 33rd Millennium, Cypher once again returned the Lion Helm and Sword of Secrets to the Dark Angels after the chapter had lost them to orcs. Think about that. The most hated enemy of the Dark Angels, the fallen they have pursued with murderous obsession for millennia, are kept returning their most sacred relics. What kind of enemy does that? What kind of traitor safeguards the symbols of the very organization that wants to kill him? The Lion Helm alone is one of the most powerful artifacts in the Dark Angel's possession, incorporating a protective force field that can be activated even when the helm is not being worn. The Sword of Secrets is the weapon of the Supreme Grand Master, a symbol of authority that has been passed down for 10,000 years. And Cypher returning these items is like a burglar breaking into a house, stealing the family heirlooms, and then mailing them back with a polite note. In the year 997 of the 33rd Millennium, Cypher appeared on the recruiting world of the Angels of Redemption and corrupted it. Or, depending on your interpretation, he exposed corruption that was already there. The planet had been paying its tithes on time, and the Imperium did not particularly care about anything else, so the matter was quietly swept under the rug. But the Angels of Redemption remembered. They always remember. At some point, Cypher guided the Dark Angels to the feral world of Chimeria. This detail might seem minor, but Chimeria is significant for one very specific reason. It is the homeworld of Azrael, who would become the Supreme Grand Master of the Dark Angels. Cypher led them to the world that would produce their future leader. Was this deliberate? Was Cypher ensuring that the right man would eventually rise to command the chapter, or was it coincidence? With Cypher, nothing is ever coincidence. During the Nova Terra Interregnum, a period in the 34th and 35th millennia, when the Imperium was effectively split in two by political and religious conflict, Cypher appeared on the Council of Nova Terra. He was part of the governing body that ruled half of the entire Imperium. Let that sink in. A single fallen angel, one of the most wanted fugitives in the galaxy, sat on a council that controlled the destinies of billions of humans across thousands of worlds. What he did there, what influence he exerted, what plans he advanced or disrupted, remains completely unknown. In the year 624 of the 36th millennium, Cypher fought the Satan, known as the Deceiver. Not in real space, where such a battle would have been incredible enough, but in the warp itself. The Satan are beings of almost incomprehensible power, star gods, who predate the existence of most sentient life in the galaxy. The Deceiver, also known as Mephetron, is among the most cunning of these entities, a being whose entire existence revolves around manipulation, lies, and the exploitation of mortal weaknesses. That Cypher survived an encounter with such a being is remarkable enough. That he fought it in the warp, a dimension that the Satan have historically been unable to enter or even comprehend, it adds another layer of impossibility to an already impossible event. The paradox of a material being fighting a star god in a dimension of pure psychic energy created temporal anomalies so severe that Cypher's Cetan phase knife, a weapon similar to those used by the deadly Kaleidus assassins, became trapped in a loop outside the normal space-time continuum. He simultaneously possesses the blade and does not possess it. The knife exists and does not exist at the same time. As Cypher broke the laws of physics, and the universe has not yet figured out how to fix the error, the Escavan campaign provides another window into Cypher's maddening unpredictability. He appears to have worked alongside the Red Corsairs, one of the most powerful renegade space marine warbands in the galaxy, only to betray them at a critical moment. The Red Corsairs were furious, believing they had been used and discarded. They pursued Cypher to a strike cruiser called the Rapier, cornering the vessel in the deep emptiness of space. When they boarded, they found only Chaos cultists. Cypher himself had vanished. Before the cultists were slain, none of them could explain where the mysterious space marine had gone or how he had escaped from a sealed vessel in the void between stars. The Red Corsairs never forgave the slight, and their hatred of Cypher added yet another faction to the growing list of powers that wanted him dead. Yet he has also appeared as the so-called voice of the Emperor, spreading what was termed the second plague of unbelief across entire sectors. The religious upheaval he caused was significant enough to attract the attention of the Officio Assassinorum, the Imperium's most lethal secret agency. Multiple operatives from different temples were dispatched to eliminate him, each one a killing machine trained from childhood in the arts of murder. The Calidus assassins, are masters of disguise and infiltration. The Vindicar assassins, peerless marksmen capable of killing from impossible distances. The Eversaur assassins, chemically enhanced berserkers designed to destroy everything in their path. Every single attempt failed. Cypher anticipated their movements, avoided their traps, and escaped their kill zones with an ease that left the Officio's leadership struggling to explain how one target could consistently defeat the most dangerous assassins in the Imperium. And he was briefly captured by the Black Templars, one of the most zealous and combat-effective chapters in the Imperium, warriors who make even other Space Marines uncomfortable with the intensity of their devotion. He escaped from their custody as well. His confirmed kills tell their own story. Planetary governors, Chaos Lords, Space Marine chapter masters, sorceress covens, cult leaders, high-ranking inquisitors. He has eliminated threats to the Imperium and allies of it with equal ease. Yet he has fought alongside Chaos Terminators, and then, in the very next engagement, fought alongside Imperial forces against the same enemies he was previously allied with. He betrays nearly everyone he works with eventually, but his betrayals always seem to serve some purpose that only he can perceive. The one consistent thread through all of these appearances, the single pattern that the Dark Angels librarians have been able to identify after compiling centuries of data, is a direction. Cypher is moving toward terror, slowly, inexorably, with detours and diversions that span centuries. He has been making his way toward the throne world of the Imperium, toward the Golden Throne, toward the Emperor of Mankind. But before we discuss his most audacious move toward terror, we need to address one of the most mind-bending events in Cypher's long history, the Tukulcha incident. In the 41st millennium, Cypher did something that no one expected. He turned himself in, and he surrendered to the inner circle of the Dark Angels voluntarily, presenting himself to the very people who had been hunting him for 10,000 years. The shock within the inner circle must have been extraordinary. Their greatest enemy, the fallen they had pursued across the millennia with obsessive determination, simply walked through the door and offered himself up. But Cypher had not come to repent. He had come with information and a plan, and he revealed that the Rock had been harboring an ancient device called the Tukulcha, a sentient engine of enormous power that, when combined with two other devices, the Ouroboros, and a third engine held by the Death Guard commander Typhus, could create a bridge through time itself. Cypher warned that a faction of Fallen, led by the renegade Astellan, had been cooperating with Typhus, and that together they planned to use these three devices to create a new Death Angels Legion. It's combining Typhus's plague fleet with the original army of Fallen from 10,000 years ago. The implications were catastrophic. If Astellan and Typhus succeeded, they would not merely summon reinforcements from the past. They would rewrite history itself, potentially preventing the destruction of Caliban and creating a timeline in which the Fallen never fell. Or worse, one in which they won their war against the Lion and the loyalist Dark Angels. And the fate of the Imperium could be altered retroactively, erased from existence by enemies reaching backward through time to change the outcome of a battle that had already been fought. The Watchers in the Dark, those mysterious beings who had inhabited Caliban since before humanity arrived on the planet, supported Cypher's mission. Their endorsement was enough to convince the inner circle to act, though the decision was made with enormous reluctance. The Dark Angels agreed to help Cypher use the Tukulcha to counter Astellan and Typhus's plan. Eventually, all three devices were brought within proximity of the ruins of Caliban, and a time portal was opened. But as enemy Fallen closed in on the portal, the chief librarian Ezekiel convinced Supreme Grand Master Azrael to destroy it. Ezekiel argued that history should not be rewritten, that the risk of changing the past was too great, and that the fallen might bring catastrophe upon all of mankind by altering the course of events. Azrael made his decision. He commanded the Tukulcha to scatter all those near the rift, and in doing so, inadvertently created the very warp storm that had originally scattered the fallen 10,000 years earlier. The future created the past, the circle closed, and Cypher vanished once again, and the thing he carries on his back, the weapon he has never drawn in 10,000 years of combat. It may be the key to understanding why. Of all the mysteries that surround the being known as Cypher, none is as enduring or as significant as the sword. It hangs across his back in every depiction, in every sighting report, in every picked capture that the Dark Angels and the Inquisition have compiled over the millennia. It is always there, and it is never, ever drawn. Consider how strange this is. Space Marines are, at their core, warriors. Everything about their existence, from the moment they are selected as aspirants to the day they fall in battle, is oriented around combat. Their bodies are weapons. Their armor is a weapons platform. Their training encompasses every form of warfare known to the Imperium, from precise ranged marksmanship to the brutal savagery of close-quarters assault. A Space Marine who carries a weapon and never uses it is an anomaly so profound that it would attract attention even in a galaxy full of anomalies. And Cypher's sword is not just any weapon. Even from a distance, even through grainy picked captures and fragmentary sensor readings, the blade is clearly something extraordinary. Its crossguard is distinctive, its construction suggesting origins that predate the Horus Heresy. It is a weapon of obvious quality and obvious significance. And the fact that it is strapped to the back of a hooded figure who refuses to draw it despite 10,000 years of constant warfare is one of the most tantalizing riddles in the entire setting. In the press of close combat, when enemies are bearing down on him from all sides, Cypher fights with his twin pistols. His bolt pistol speaks with deadly precision, each shot finding its mark with an accuracy that borders on the supernatural. His plasma pistol, an ancient and master-crafted weapon, fires without the characteristic overheating that plagues lesser versions of this technology. He wields both weapons simultaneously, moving and shooting with a fluid grace that has been compared to watching the Emperor's own wrath made manifest. He does not miss. In game terms, his ballistic skill has been rated at 10, the highest value in the system, meaning that he hits his target approximately 97% of the time. In a galaxy where even the finest marksmen occasionally miss, how Cypher simply does not. His fighting style is unique among Space Marines. Where most Astartes are trained to fight in formations, to advance as part of a squad or company with overlapping fields of fire and mutual support, Cypher fights alone. He moves through combat like water through rocks, flowing around obstacles and resistance with a fluidity that suggests either inhuman reflexes or some form of precognition. His blazing weapons abilities, as it has been termed by the few scholars who have studied his combat footage, allows him to fire each pistol twice in rapid succession while moving, or to fire both weapons and then immediately reposition, or to reposition and then fire. He can even use his pistols effectively at point-blank range in hand-to-hand combat, placing shots with surgical precision even while enemies are grappling with him at arm's length. He fires in Overwatch at his full accuracy, which means that even when reacting to an enemy charge, a situation where most warriors aim degrades significantly under the stress of incoming contact, Cypher places his shots as though he were standing still on a firing range with all the time in the world. Some have speculated that this preternatural accuracy is a product of psychic ability, that Cypher uses some form of time dilation or precognitive awareness to predict where his targets will be and place his shots accordingly. If Zahariel is indeed Cypher, this explanation carries weight, as Zahariel was one of the most gifted psychers in the Dark Angels Legion, and his connection to the Watchers in the Dark may have granted him abilities that transcend even the normal range of Space Marine librarians. His physical appearance is itself a puzzle. He wears power armor that bears elements from multiple different patterns, as though it has been repaired and modified countless times over the centuries using whatever components were available. His backpack has been altered so many times that its original configuration is unrecognizable. Over the armor, he wears robes of bone white and a weathered cowl that conceals his features. The cowl and cloak are torn and tattered, showing the wear of millennia of constant movement and constant conflict. The overall impression is of a renegade and a warrior without a chapter or a home, surviving on resourcefulness and skill rather than the institutional support that most Space Marines take for granted. But the sword stays on his back. Enemies have gotten close enough to touch him in melee. He has fought his way out of ambushes, through kill zones, past entire companies of Space Marines sent specifically to capture or kill him. In all of those encounters, against all of those enemies, he has never once reached for the sword. He fights with his pistols at point-blank range, dancing and weaving through the chaos of close combat with the preternatural speed that has made him a legend among both the fallen and the unforgiven. The sword might as well not exist, for all the use he makes of it in battle. So what is it? Why does he carry it? Why does he guard it with such ferocity, and yet refuse to use it? The rumors have persisted for millennia, passed in whispers among those few individuals who know of Cypher's existence. The sword, they say, is the Lion Sword, the personal weapon of Primarch Lion L. Johnson himself. The Lion Sword was a weapon of extraordinary power, forged from the fang of one of the great beasts of Caliban, a Calibanite lion. It carried within it the spirit of that beast, granting its wielder the creature's strength, agility, cunning, and resilience. The lion carried it throughout the Great Crusade and the Horus Heresy. It was broken at some point during those conflicts, as shattered in circumstances that the records do not fully explain. One account indicates that it was broken by Rabut Gilliman himself during a confrontation between the two Primarchs. Another suggests that it was damaged during the fighting on Caliban. What we do know is that the sword was reforged. A Dark Angels officer named Holgin took upon himself the task of making it whole again. And by the end of the heresy, the lion was once again carrying a complete weapon. He used it in a private meeting with Leman Russ, the Primarch of the Space Wolves, at the Imperial Palace after the Siege of Terra. In that meeting, the two brothers resolved the bitter feud that had existed between them, and the lion drove the sword through Russ's chest, not to kill, but to test. He turned the blade aside at the last moment, sparing his brother's life. Russ, in turn, came to respect and admire the lion, calling him the best of them all. After the destruction of Caliban, the lion sword disappeared along with the Primarch himself, taken by the Watchers in the dark to wherever they concealed his sleeping form deep within the rock. And then, at some point that no one can pinpoint with any certainty, it appeared on the back of a hooded figure in power armor who walked the galaxy with twin pistols and a purpose that no one could fathom. The physical evidence is compelling. Games Workshop's own model for the Lionel Johnson character includes the lion sword with a distinctive crossguard that is identical to the weapon carried by Cypher's model. The match is too precise to be coincidental. The sword that Cypher carries is, in all likelihood, the lion sword itself. But the question remains, what does he intend to do with it? There are two primary theories, and they could not be more different from each other. The first theory holds that Cypher seeks to present the lion sword to the Emperor of Mankind and beg forgiveness for the fallen. In this interpretation, Cypher's 10,000-year journey across the galaxy is an act of penance, a pilgrimage of almost inconceivable duration, undertaken to right the wrongs committed on Caliban. If the Emperor were to accept the sword and grant absolution to the fallen, the Dark Angel's shame would be lifted. The unforgiven could finally forgive themselves. The great wound at the heart of the First Legion would be healed. Some among the unforgiven have speculated along these lines, though they dare not voice such thoughts too loudly. The idea that their greatest enemy might be trying to save them is almost too much to bear. It would mean that every attempt they have made to capture or kill Cypher has been an act of self-sabotage, that they have been fighting against their own redemption for 10,000 years. The second theory is darker, far darker. In this interpretation, Cypher seeks to reach the Golden Throne not to beg forgiveness, but to use the Lion Sword to slay the Emperor himself, to end the 10,000-year half-life of the Master of Mankind and plunge the Imperium into the final darkness. In this reading, Cypher is not a penitent seeking absolution. He is the ultimate weapon of chaos, a sleeper agent carrying the one blade that might be capable of finishing what Horus started. The truth is that nobody knows. Not even the authors who write the stories seem to have a definitive answer. This ambiguity is deliberate, and it is what makes Cypher one of the most compelling characters in the entire setting. He exists in the space between hero and villain, between salvation and damnation, and every action he takes can be interpreted either way. When Master of Repentance Asmodai, one of the most feared interrogator chaplains in the Dark Angel's history, touched the crimson and gold pommel of the sword, yet he experienced a vision. He felt a blade pierce his gut. He dropped his own weapon as he tumbled with the snarling foe. The vision was violent, visceral, and completely ambiguous. Was he seeing the sword being used to save or to destroy? The vision offered no answers, only more questions. The sword has never been drawn. In 10,000 years of combat, Cypher has never pulled it from its scabbard, never tested its edge against an enemy, never so much as loosened it in its housing. At this restraint is either the most extraordinary act of self-discipline in the history of the galaxy, or evidence that the sword is in some way incomplete, broken, or bound by some condition that has not yet been met. Some accounts suggest that the blade remains broken, that Cypher carries the fragments and seeks a means to reforge them. Others indicate that the sword is whole, but cannot be drawn until certain conditions are fulfilled, might perhaps requiring it to be in the presence of the Emperor himself, or perhaps waiting for some cosmic alignment of events that has not yet occurred. The mystery of the sword is, in many ways, the mystery of Cypher himself, made physical and tangible. It is a weapon that contains within it the potential for either the greatest redemption or the greatest catastrophe in Imperial history, and until it is finally drawn, no one can know which it will be. Guilliman recognized the blade. When the resurrected Primarch of the Ultramarines saw the sword on Cypher's back, he knew what it was, and it filled him with something that was not quite fear, but was certainly not comfort. He knew his brother's weapon, and he knew that whatever Cypher intended to do with it, letting it anywhere near the Emperor, was a risk he was not willing to take. That recognition would have enormous consequences. But to understand those consequences, we need to follow Cypher to the most important moment in his long, strange journey. We need to talk about the gathering storm. The galaxy was ending. That is not hyperbole or dramatic exaggeration. In the closing years of the 41st millennium, events that had been building for 10,000 years reached their catastrophic climax. The long war that the forces of chaos had been waging against the Imperium since the Horus heresy was entering its final, most destructive phase. Abaddon the Despoiler, or the War Master of Chaos, who had inherited Horus's mantle of leadership over the traitor legions, launched his 13th Black Crusade, the largest chaos invasion since the heresy itself. 13 times Abaddon had led his forces out of the Eye of Terror, and 12 times he had been defeated or driven back. But this time was different. This time, he was not seeking merely to conquer territory or to prove his strength against the defenders of the Cadian Gate. This time, he sought to break the galaxy itself. The fortress world of Cadia, which had stood as the Imperium's bulwark against the Eye of Terror for millennia, was destroyed. Not conquered, not occupied, but annihilated. Abaddon dropped the wreckage of a blackstone fortress onto the planet's surface, cracking it like a stone egg and releasing the warp energies that had been held at bay by the ancient pylons embedded in Cadia's bedrock. Its loss tore a wound in reality itself, a wound that bled raw warp energy across the width of the galaxy. From that wound poured the Great Rift, a galaxy-spanning tear in the fabric of space-time that effectively cut the Imperium in half. Worlds that had relied on warp travel for communication, trade, and military support found themselves isolated, trapped on the wrong side of an impassable barrier of psychic energy and demonic fury. Billions died in the first days alone, and the death toll would only climb as the consequences of the Great Rift rippled outward across every segmentum. In the midst of this apocalypse, with the Imperium teetering on the brink of total collapse, a desperate plan was hatched. On the world of Macragge, the seat of the Ultramarines chapter, a coalition of heroes undertook the unthinkable. Using ancient technology and the psychic power of the newly formed Inari, a faction of Eldar death worshippers, they revived Roboute Guilliman, the Primarch of the Ultramarines, who had lain in stasis for nearly 10,000 years after being fatally wounded by the demon Primarch Fulgrim. Guilliman awoke to a galaxy he barely recognized. The Imperium he and his father had built was a bloated, rotting thing, sustained by fear and superstition rather than reason and hope. The secular truth the Emperor had championed had been replaced by a religious cult that worshipped him as a god. Guilliman was horrified, and he was furious. He decided to journey to Terra, to kneel at the foot of the Golden Throne and seek guidance from his father. The Terran Crusade, as this journey would come to be known, was a desperate odyssey through a galaxy tearing itself apart. The warp was in turmoil, making navigation almost impossible. Warp storms of unprecedented ferocity lashed the space lanes, and the Chaos Gods, sensing the Primarch's resurrection, threw everything they had at him to prevent him from reaching Terra. The fleet was ambushed by Magnus the Red and his 1,000 sons, who used their sorcerous powers to drag the Imperial vessels into the Maelstrom, the great warp storm that had plagued the galaxy since before the age of the Imperium. Lost in that swirling madness, hounded by demons and the machinations of Kairos Fateweaver, Guilliman and his crusade were eventually captured by the Red Corsairs, a powerful Chaos warband, and imprisoned in a black stone fortress hidden within the Maelstrom. As it was there, at the lowest point of the Terran Crusade, that Cypher appeared. He came with the Harlequin Shadowseer Silandri Veilwalker, the same enigmatic Eldar who had been manipulating events behind the scenes throughout the entire Gathering Storm crisis. Together, they infiltrated the Blackstone Fortress and reached Guilliman's cell. Cypher killed the Red Corsair Guard, took the key, and made the Primarch an offer. He would free Guilliman and all of his followers, yet he would guide them out of the Maelstrom and help them reach Terra. But in return, Guilliman had to agree to one condition. He would bring Cypher to the Golden Throne. Guilliman agreed. He had no choice. Without Cypher's intervention, the Terran Crusade would have ended in that Blackstone fortress, and the Imperium would have lost its last, best hope. It is a measure of Cypher's strategic intelligence that he engineered a situation where even a Primarch had no option but to accept his terms. Guilliman, one of the most brilliant military minds in the history of the Imperium, a being capable of processing strategic information at a level that makes ordinary genius look like incompetence, was outmaneuvered by a single hooded figure with 2 pistols and a hidden agenda. Cypher freed the Primarch and his forces. The operation was breathtaking in its scope. Not only did Cypher release Guilliman himself, but he also freed Saint Celestine and her Gemini superior, the Archmagos Dominus Belisarius Call, and his entire Mechanicus detachment, including dune crawlers and ranks of Skitarii, Grandmaster Voldus and his Grey Knights, along with their Dread Knights, and dozens of other vehicles and dreadnoughts. The scale of the jailbreak was absurd, the kind of operation that should have required an entire army to execute. And Cypher pulled it off with a squad of Harlequins and his own seemingly inexhaustible talent for being in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. The escape was aided by an attack from Skarbrand, one of Khorne's most fearsome bloodthirsters, who assaulted the Blackstone Fortress at precisely the moment when its defenders were most vulnerable. Whether this was coincidence, or whether some unseen hand had arranged for the Blood God's champion to create a distraction at the perfect moment, is another one of those questions that will probably never be answered. The Legion of the Damned, those spectral space marines who appear at moments of the Imperium's greatest need before vanishing without explanation, also intervened. The convergence of so many seemingly random events at a single point in time and space suggests manipulation on a level that would be impressive even for the Chaos Gods. Cypher then guided the freed prisoners through a webway portal, bypassing the warp entirely and emerging in real space near Luna. Once in the webway, Cypher was met by some of his fallen allies, the warriors who had been drawn to his side through whatever mysterious process allows the fallen to locate and follow their most famous member. From there, Cypher fought alongside Guilliman in the battle against Magnus the Red, who had brought his 1,000 sons to prevent the Primarch from reaching Terra. The battle on Luna was savage, with Magnus's psychic powers threatening to overwhelm Guilliman until the arrival of the Sisters of Silence and the Adeptus Custodes turned the tide. But Magnus was driven back into the webway, and the gate was sealed behind him. The Terran Crusade reached Terra. Guilliman and his forces landed at the Imperial Palace, and the Primarch prepared to enter the throne room to meet with his father. But at the doors of the Sanctum Imperialis, things went wrong for Cypher. The Custodes announced that only the Primarch would be allowed to enter the throne room. Cypher protested. He had not crossed the galaxy, survived 10,000 years of warfare, manipulated events on a cosmic scale, and rescued a Primarch from imprisonment just to be turned away at the last step. But it was not the Custodes who sealed his fate. It was Guilliman himself. The Primarch looked at the sword on Cypher's back, and he recognized it. He knew that blade. He had broken its predecessor with his own hands during his confrontation with the Lion during the Horus Heresy. And whatever Cypher's intentions might be, Guilliman was not willing to let that weapon anywhere near his father. Guilliman broke his deal. He ordered the Adeptus Custodes to arrest Cypher and his fallen companions. They were stripped of their weapons, and the Lion Sword was confiscated and handed over to the Officio Assassinorum for safekeeping. Cypher and the Fallen were thrown into the dark cells beneath the Imperial Palace, the most secure prison in the Imperium, a facility from which no one had ever escaped. Cypher escaped within hours. The sheer audacity of this fact deserves a moment of appreciation. The dark cells beneath the Imperial Palace were designed to hold the most dangerous prisoners in the entire Imperium. They were built during the Great Crusade, reinforced over 10,000 years, and protected by redundancies upon redundancies of physical, psychic, and technological safeguards. No prisoner had ever escaped from the dark cells, not a single one, in 10 millennia of operation. Daemon princes had been held there. Alien warlords of terrifying power had been contained within those walls. The dark cells were considered escape-proof by every authority in the Imperium. Cypher treated them like a minor inconvenience. What followed was one of the most extraordinary sequences of events in the history of the Imperial Palace, and it is told in remarkable detail in the novel Cypher, Lord of the Fallen, by John French. The book is written from Cypher's own perspective, and it is crucial to understand that the narrator is explicitly unreliable. Everything Cypher says, thinks, and describes in the novel is filtered through the consciousness of a being who has been deceiving everyone he has met for 10 millennia. The truth, and Cypher's version of the truth, may not be the same thing, and that deliberate ambiguity is part of what makes the novel so compelling. We see the events through the eyes of a liar, and we are invited to sift through his words for grains of truth buried in layers of misdirection. The escape from the dark cells was not a simple breakout. It was enabled by a cascade of failures that began when a small force of dark angels, led by an officer named Mordachi, infiltrated the Imperial Palace during the demonic incursion that accompanied the opening of the Great Rift. The Dark Angels had learned that Cypher was being held in the palace, and their obsessive need to capture the Fallen for themselves overrode every other consideration, including the fact that they were sabotaging the defenses of the throne world during a major chaos assault. Mordachi's force destroyed generators that powered the dark cells. Under normal circumstances, The cells had multiple redundancies that would have prevented such sabotage from having any effect. But these were not normal circumstances. Terror was under siege. Demons were walking on the birth world of humanity. The palace's systems were already strained beyond their limits by battle damage, warp incursions, and the sheer scale of the catastrophe unfolding overhead. The Dark Angel's reckless actions created cascading failures that opened the cells. Cypher and his fallen brethren, including warriors named Azkar, Bakariel, and Korlael, were free. But they were far from safe. The Imperial Palace is not a building, but it is a continent-sized complex of fortifications, cathedrals, bureaucratic warrens, and military installations that sprawls across a significant portion of the Himalayas. Between Cypher and his goal lay thousands of custodies, companies of dark angels who were hunting him, and Imperial assassins who had been dispatched to ensure he never reached the throne room. What followed was a running battle through the bowels of the palace. A deadly game of cat and mouse played against some of the most dangerous warriors in the galaxy. Cypher demonstrated abilities that seemed to defy explanation. He predicted events before they happened, as if he could see the future or had memorized the patterns of history so thoroughly that the present was merely a confirmation of what he already knew. He exploited weaknesses in the palace's defenses that should have been unknown to anyone outside the highest levels of the custodies. He moved through hidden passages and forgotten corridors, with the confidence of someone who had walked them before, though the palace had been sealed to outsiders for 10,000 years. The Fallen recovered their war gear. Cypher destroyed the central palace communication hub, sowing confusion among his pursuers. He fought through dark angels, custodies, and assassins with a lethal efficiency that left even his enemies impressed. And through it all, he moved with unwavering purpose toward one destination, the throne room. He used a forgotten doorway to the Sanctum Imperialis, a passage called the Path of Martyrs. He fought off the pursuing dark angels and assassins. He reached the Bridge of Ascension, the final approach to the throne room itself. He was within feet of the door, and then a single custodian warden stood in his path. Hecaron was badly wounded. He had been tracking Cypher from the beginning of the escape, and moving through the chaos of the palace siege with a determination that matched Cypher's own. While demons poured through breaches in terror's reality, while the sky above the palace burned with the light of the Great Rift tearing itself open across the galaxy, while billions screamed in terror at the end of everything they had ever known, this one custodian had kept his focus on a single target. He had fought his way through the same corridors that Cypher had navigated, and had tracked the same trail of bodies and disabled security systems, had refused to be distracted by the apocalypse erupting around him, and now, at the end of that chase, he stood between Cypher and the throne room with nothing but his wounds and a message. He was in no condition to fight. He was barely standing. His golden armor, the master-crafted plate that marked him as one of the Emperor's most trusted guardians, was scarred and dented from a dozen engagements. Blood, in his own and that of his enemies, decorated his frame like war paint. Any other warrior would have been lying in a Medici facility, not standing at the end of a bridge with a fugitive approaching at speed. But he carried a message, and it was a message that Cypher could not ignore. The Emperor had spoken to Hecaron, not in words exactly, because the Emperor has not spoken in words for 10,000 years. His communication, such as it is, comes in flashes of psychic impression, and in visions that burn themselves into the recipient's consciousness with the force of a star going nova. For a custodian to receive such a communication is extraordinary. The Emperor speaks to his guardians only rarely, and only when the matter is of the utmost importance. Whatever message Hecaron carried, it came from the highest possible authority in the Imperium, from the being who sits at the center of the human species' continued existence, and the being whose will holds the Astronomicon alight, and whose psychic strength keeps the Golden Throne functional, and the webway breach beneath the palace sealed against the demons that press against it from the other side. And the message was simple. Not yet. Cypher stopped. After 10,000 years of walking toward this moment, after crossing the galaxy, surviving countless battles, escaping from impossible situations, and fighting his way through the very heart of the Imperium's defenses. More, he stopped. He looked at the wounded custodian. He looked at the door behind him, the door that had been his destination for 100 centuries, the door beyond which sat the only being in the galaxy who might be able to give meaning to everything he had endured. And he accepted the message. He did not fight. He did not argue. He did not try to push past the dying custodian and force his way through. A being who had demonstrated the ability to defeat assassins, custodes, and space marines in combat, who had fought his way through the most heavily defended structure in the Imperium, simply accepted 2 words from a wounded man and turned around. He left. He turned around, gathered his fallen, and walked out of the Imperial Palace. Not because he was forced to, not because he was defeated, but because the Emperor himself had told him the time was not right. The implications of this moment are staggering. It means the Emperor is aware of Cypher, and it means the Emperor has some knowledge of what Cypher intends to do. And it means that the Emperor, for reasons of his own, believes that whatever Cypher is carrying and whatever he plans to do with it should happen, just not yet. Not yet is not never. It is not a rejection, it is a postponement. It implies that there will come a time when Cypher's mission will be fulfilled, when whatever he carries on his back will be drawn and used for the purpose it was always intended to serve. Yet the Emperor has not closed the door. He has merely asked Cypher to wait. After his escape from Terra, Cypher was immediately pursued again. The Dark Angels, as always, were the most relentless of his hunters. His trail led them to the shrine world of Darkmoor, where elements of 6 unforgiven chapters descended in force, searching for fallen who had materialized in the wake of the Great Rift. The opening of the Great Rift had torn reality apart across the breadth of the galaxy, and in the aftermath, fallen, who had been trapped in the warp since the destruction of Caliban, were being ejected back into real space in unprecedented numbers. The Dark Angels' librarians were working overtime, their scryers detecting new fallen signatures almost daily, and the unforgiven mobilized with a ferocity that spoke of both opportunity and desperation. At Darkmoor, multiple companies from the Angels of Vengeance, the Consecrators, and the Guardians of the Covenant converged on the Shrine World. They expected to find newly materialized fallen, confused and disoriented from their millennia-long transit through the warp. What they found instead was a nightmare. The event became known as the Massacre at Darkmoor, though the details remain classified at the highest levels of the Inner Circle. The losses were severe enough to shake even the stoic resolve of the unforgiven. And the lesson was clear. Cypher was not merely evading them. He was actively hunting the hunters, turning their obsession against them, using their predictable behavior as a weapon. The Adeptus Custodes were also in pursuit, led by Shield Captain Dareth with a combined force of custodians and Sisters of Silence. It is a measure of how seriously the Imperium's highest authorities take the threat that Cypher represents, that the Guardians of the Emperor himself have been tasked with recapturing him. The Custodes are not ordinary warriors. They are the personal bodyguard of the Emperor, each one a masterwork of genetic engineering and martial training that makes even a space marine look crude by comparison. The fact that Cypher has evaded them, outwitted them, and survived encounters with them only adds to his legend. And there is one more detail that deepens the conspiracy further. The Custodes' force pursuing Cypher is itself being shadowed by an unidentified fleet of ships. Someone, or something, is watching the Watchers, adding yet another layer of manipulation to a situation that was already impossibly convoluted. Whether this unseen force is allied with Cypher, opposed to him, or pursuing its own independent agenda is unknown. And somewhere out in the darkness, Cypher continues to walk. Still carrying the sword he has never drawn, still moving toward a destiny that only he can see. So who is Cypher? After everything we have discussed, after 10,000 years of mystery and bloodshed and whispered rumors, can we come any closer to an answer? The truth is that Games Workshop has deliberately left Cypher's identity unresolved. Multiple candidates have been proposed over the years, and each with their own supporting evidence, and each raising more questions than they answer. The strongest candidate remains Zahariel El-Zurias. The evidence is compelling. Zahariel was promoted to the position of Lord Cypher by Luther himself. He was a powerful psyker, which would explain Cypher's seemingly supernatural abilities, his uncanny prescience, and his impossible escapes. He had a confirmed connection to the Watchers in the Dark, which would explain how Cypher seems to be protected by some higher power. He was one of only 4 people who knew the code word Starfire, the same word that Cypher spoke during his most recent capture by the Dark Angels. And his complicated loyalties, a rebel against the Imperium who was not aligned with chaos, a man caught between duty and love for his homeworld, perfectly mirror the impossible to categorize behavior that Cypher has displayed for millennia. There are problems with this theory, of course. In the Legacy of Caliban novel series, the Lord Cypher who turns himself over to the inner circle does not behave like Zahariel. He lacks the malice that you might expect from a former rebel, and the Watchers in the Dark, who were not on good terms with Zahariel during the heresy, seem to actively support the current Cypher. This has led some to speculate that Zahariel may have been the Cypher of the heresy era, but that the title has since passed to someone else. Another candidate that has been proposed is Farthest Redloss, the first captain of the Dark Angels Dreadwing and commander of the Lion's Honor Guard. Redloss was a native of Caliban, who rose to one of the most trusted positions in the entire Legion. His fate after the destruction of Caliban is unaccounted for, and his close relationship with the Lion would explain why he might carry the Primarch's sword. However, Guilliman did not recognize Cypher when they met during the Terran Crusade, and it seems likely that he would have recognized Redloss, who was a prominent figure during the heresy era. A particularly interesting candidate is Corswain, the seneschal of the Dark Angels, and one of the Lion's most trusted warriors during the Horus heresy. Corswain is essentially unaccounted for after the destruction of Caliban. The modern Dark Angels venerate him as a hero, but there is no record of his death or any indication of what happened to him after the fall of Caliban. He was the first outsider loyalist to reach the solar system during the Siege of Terra, and he is one of the few individuals the Fallen still regard with genuine dread. The idea that Corzin might be Cypher, seeking a final merciless absolution for the Fallen, carries a certain poetic weight. A hero of the First Legion, one of the Lion's most loyal sons, taking on the mantle of a villain in order to save his brothers from themselves. It would also explain why the Fallen are drawn to Cypher, despite his often antagonistic relationship with them. They would sense in him the authority and the presence of one of the Lion's greatest champions, even if they could not identify him behind the hood and cloak. There is also the suggestion, raised in the Pandorax novel, that one of the Cyphers was originally destined to become one of Malcador's Knights Errant and one of the founding Grand Masters of the Grey Knights. Grandmaster Epimetheus, one of the original Grey Knights, was revealed to be a fallen angel who had been asleep for 10,000 years. When a Lord of Change confronted him, the demon was confused, as if expecting a different person, and actually showed fear at the consequences of encountering Epimetheus instead of whoever it was expecting. This connection between the Grey Knights, the Fallen, and the title of Cypher opens up yet another avenue of speculation. If Zahariel became Cypher, but later passed the mantle to someone else before joining the Knights Errant, it would explain both why Cypher displays Zahariel's characteristics and why the two are not definitively the same person. But perhaps the most unsettling theory is that Cypher is not any single individual. The title of Lord Cypher was always meant to be passed from one bearer to the next. The original Lord Cypher renounced his name and identity upon taking the mantle. It is conceivable that this practice has continued for 10,000 years, with different individuals assuming the role of Cypher as needed, each one inheriting the equipment, the purpose, and perhaps even the memories of their predecessors. Under this theory, Cypher is not a person, but an idea, a self-perpetuating mission that has been carried forward across the millennia by a succession of agents who surrender their individual identities in service to something larger than themselves. This would explain many of the inconsistencies in Cypher's behavior and abilities. It would explain how a single space marine could survive for 10,000 years without the aid of chaos or some other form of immortality. It would explain the variation in his tactics and personality across different accounts. And it would mean that killing Cypher would be meaningless because the role would simply pass to someone else. The Dark Angels would be hunting a ghost, a concept wearing power armor, and they could never truly catch it because it was not a thing that could be caught. Every time they claimed a kill, every time they thought they had finally ended the hunt, a new Cypher would emerge from the shadows, pick up the fallen pistols and the undrawn sword, and continue the mission. The title would outlive every bearer, just as it was designed to do when it was first created in the knightly halls of Caliban, back when the preservation of tradition was understood to be more important than the survival of any single individual. But whatever the truth of his identity, the meaning of Cypher in the broader context of Warhammer 40,000 is something that can be discussed with more certainty. Cypher represents the unresolved. He is the question that the Dark Angels cannot answer, the sin they cannot confess, the wound they cannot heal. He is the walking embodiment of ambiguity in a universe that desperately wants everything to be black and white, loyal or traitor, friend or foe. There is something profoundly human about the Dark Angels' relationship with Cypher, despite the fact that none of the parties involved are exactly human anymore. The Dark Angels are defined by shame, and they carry a secret so terrible that they believe its exposure would destroy them, not physically, but spiritually. They have built their entire identity around concealing that secret and atoning for the sin it represents. And Cypher is the living reminder that the sin cannot be hidden, that the secret has legs and walks the galaxy, that no matter how deep they bury the truth, it will always find a way to the surface. In psychological terms, Cypher is the return of the repressed. And he is the thing the Dark Angels locked away in the deepest dungeon of their collective consciousness, the thing they told themselves they could control and contain, and he keeps escaping. Every time they think they have captured him, he slips away. Every time they believe they have finally resolved the mystery, he appears somewhere new with some new, impossible action that throws all their assumptions into question. He is the proof that you cannot solve a problem by pretending it does not exist. And the Dark Angels have spent 10,000 years trying to impose order on the chaos of their own history. They have buried the truth, rewritten the records, and killed anyone who threatened to expose their secret. They have built an entire organizational structure around the idea that the fallen are traitors who must be captured and forced to repent. Their identity as a chapter depends on this narrative. Without the hunt for the fallen, the Dark Angels lose their purpose. Without the shame, they lose what makes them who they are. Consider also what Cypher represents from the perspective of the broader Imperium. In a galaxy where loyalty is enforced through fear and deviation from orthodoxy is punishable by death, Cypher is the ultimate free agent. He answers to no authority. He follows no orders except his own. He moves through imperial space and chaos-held territory with equal facility, unbeholden to either side, serving a purpose that transcends the petty territorial conflicts of gods and empires. In a universe defined by rigid hierarchies and absolute obedience, Cypher is the embodiment of individual will. He has chosen his own path, and he has walked it for 10,000 years without wavering, without surrendering his agency to any external power. This makes him dangerous to everyone. The Imperium cannot tolerate a free agent operating outside its control, and especially one who possesses the combat abilities and strategic acumen that Cypher has demonstrated. The forces of Chaos cannot trust him because he has betrayed Chaos servants as readily as he has betrayed Imperial ones. The Dark Angels cannot ignore him because his very existence threatens their most carefully guarded secret. And the Emperor, whatever his current state of consciousness may be, has apparently chosen to acknowledge Cypher's mission without yet granting him access to the throne room. Cypher exists in the spaces between all of these powers, belonging to none of them, answerable to none of them, and feared by all of them. And then along comes Cypher, who refuses to fit into any category. He is not a straightforward traitor. He has helped the Imperium as often as he has worked against it. He has returned sacred relics. He has rescued Primarchs. Yet he has fought Chaos Gods and Chaos Servants alike. He carries what might be the key to the Dark Angel's redemption on his back, but he will not let them take it from him. He is their greatest enemy and possibly their only hope, and they cannot tell the difference. That is the horror of Cypher. Not that he might be evil, because evil can be understood and fought. The horror is that he might be right. More that the Dark Angel's obsessive secrecy and their ruthless hunt for the fallen might be exactly the wrong response to the catastrophe of Caliban. That forgiveness, not vengeance, is what was always needed. And that the one being in the galaxy who has been trying to deliver that forgiveness for 10,000 years is the one they keep trying to kill. Or maybe not. Maybe Cypher is exactly what the Dark Angels fear him to be, a monster, a traitor, an agent of destruction, carrying a weapon intended to murder the Emperor and plunge the galaxy into eternal darkness. Maybe every act of apparent benevolence has been part of a scheme so complex and so patient that it makes the machinations of the Chaos Gods look like childish pranks by comparison. That is the genius of the character. You can argue either interpretation with equal conviction, and neither can be definitively proven or disproven. Cypher exists in the space between certainty and doubt, and he has made that space his home. And perhaps that is the most important thing about Cypher, when all is said and done. Not the sword, not the pistols, not the hood and cloak, and the trail of bodies that stretches across the millennia. What makes Cypher truly remarkable is what he represents about the nature of the Warhammer 40,000 universe itself. In a setting where everything is supposed to be grim and dark and certain, thus where the forces of good and evil are locked in an eternal struggle with no room for nuance, Cypher introduces doubt. He makes you question the categories. He makes you wonder whether the Imperium's definition of loyalty is the only valid one, whether the Dark Angel's definition of betrayal is as clear-cut as they believe, whether the labels we apply to heroes and villains might be more fluid than we would like to admit. And every faction in the galaxy has tried to claim Cypher for their own narrative. The Dark Angels say he is a traitor who must be destroyed. The forces of chaos have tried to recruit him to their cause. The Imperium at large, to the extent that it knows of his existence at all, sees him as a dangerous fugitive. And Cypher himself refuses all of these labels, refuses to be defined by anyone else's story, insists on writing his own. He is the author of his own myth, and he guards that authorship as jealously as he guards the sword on his back. In the novels, in the codexes, in the countless discussions and debates that have raged among fans for decades, the question always comes back to the same fundamental uncertainty. Is Cypher the Imperium's greatest threat or its greatest hope? The answer, maddeningly, is that he might be both. He might be neither. The resolution of his story, if it ever comes, will reshape the entire setting. The moment that sword is drawn, everything changes. And that potential, that loaded possibility hanging in the air like a blade suspended above the neck of the galaxy, is what gives Cypher his power. The Emperor told him, not yet, not never, not go away, not you are not welcome, just not yet. Those two words contain within them the seed of a future that could go in any direction. Not yet means that the Emperor acknowledges what Cypher carries. It means the Emperor has a plan, or at least an awareness that includes Cypher's mission in some capacity. It means that somewhere in the vast and inscrutable consciousness of the Master of Mankind, there is a place reserved for whatever Cypher is trying to do. The door is not closed. It is merely waiting to be opened at the right moment, and only the Emperor knows when that moment will arrive. For the Dark Angels, this should be terrifying. It suggests that their entire 10,000-year crusade to capture and silence the fallen might be working against the Emperor's own designs. It suggests that the shame they carry, the obsessive secrecy that defines their existence, might be not just unnecessary, but actively harmful to the very cause they believe they serve. If the Emperor wants Cypher to reach the throne room, then every Dark Angel who has ever tried to stop him has been an obstacle to the Emperor's will. The implications are almost too vast to contemplate. But the Dark Angels do not know about the Emperor's message to Hecaron. That knowledge is held by the Custodes, and the Custodes are not known for sharing their secrets. So the hunt continues. The Unforgiven pursue their quarry with the same blind determination that has characterized their efforts for 100 centuries, unaware that the prey they are chasing might be carrying the key to their salvation. One day, presumably, the time will come. Cypher will draw the sword, and the galaxy will finally learn whether the most mysterious character in Warhammer 40,000 was the Imperium's salvation or its doom. Until that day, he walks, through the darkness between the stars, through the ruins of worlds and the ashes of empires, through 10,000 years of war and betrayal and unanswered questions. A hooded figure in power armor, with a bolt pistol in one hand and a plasma pistol in the other, and a sword on his back that he has never drawn. The Dark Angels hunt him, the Custodes pursue him, the assassins stalk him, and still he walks, moving toward a destination that only he can see, carrying a burden that only he can bear, serving a purpose that only the Emperor himself might understand. His name is not really a name. It is a code, a puzzle, a riddle wrapped in shadow. It means concealment. It means mystery. Or it means that the truth is hidden, and that finding it will require more courage than most beings possess. His name is Cypher, and his story is far from over. There is one last thing worth saying before we close. In a setting that is deliberately designed to be dark, oppressive, and devoid of hope, Cypher offers something rare. He offers the possibility that things might change, that the status quo is not permanent, that the wounds of the past might someday be healed. Yet the sword on his back is not just a weapon, it is a promise that somewhere in the galaxy, someone is carrying the means to make things right, even if the path to that resolution is longer and more painful than anyone could have imagined. Whether you believe Cypher is a hero or a villain, whether you think his journey will end in redemption or damnation, there is something undeniably compelling about a character who has walked the same path for 10,000 years without ever losing sight of his destination. In a universe where entire civilizations rise and fall in the time it takes Cypher to cross a single sector, his constancy is remarkable. His patience is superhuman, even by the standards of superhumans. And his refusal to be deterred by anything, not by armies, not by gods, not even by the Emperor himself telling him to wait, it speaks to something fundamental about the power of purpose. Cypher is still out there, the sword is still undrawn, and the story is still being written. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the lore and want to hear more stories from the grim darkness of the far future, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Every like and every subscription helps us keep making content like this, and there are so many more stories left to tell. Drop a comment below and let me know. Do you think Cypher is trying to save the Emperor or destroy him? What is your theory about his true identity? Is he Zahariel, Corswain, someone else entirely? Or is Cypher not a person at all, but a title that has been passed down through the ages, an idea that wears power armor and carries the burden of redemption for an entire legion? I would love to hear your thoughts. Until next time, stay comfortable, stay curious, and remember that in the grim darkness of the far future, even the deepest mysteries eventually come to light. Take care of yourselves.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any, and yeah, sleep well.